trying to make sense of any political era can feel, well, like a real puzzle, right? Especially one as fast-moving and, frankly, complex as the Trump administration. It's easy to feel a bit lost in the noise.
Definitely. There was just so much happening.
Exactly. But that's why we're here. We've gathered a whole set of detailed notes, source materials, and we're ready to dive deep. Our goal is to cut through it all and pull out the essential insights for you. So our mission today, pretty simple, really. We want to extract the most important pieces of information, maybe some surprising facts, directly from these sources. Think of this as your shortcut to getting properly informed about the key laws, the big executive decisions, and, the whole dynamic with Congress during the Trump presidency.
And we're aiming to do more than just list things. We want to connect the dots for you, give you that vital context, focus on why things happened and why they mattered, so you can get the full picture without feeling swamped. We're laying out the facts as presented in our source material. We're inviting you to understand the ideas here so you walk away with a clearer, more nuanced view.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the Trump administration, we need to set the scene first. Understand the political landscape when things kicked off.
Right, the baseline.
Donald J. Trump is president, Mike Pence is vice president. The term was January 20, 2017, running through January 20, 2021. Pretty straightforward. But here's where it gets really interesting, and it's absolutely crucial for understanding everything else. Who controlled Congress? This changed midway through.
Yeah, that's key.
When the administration started, the 115th Congress, that's 2017 to 2019, Republicans held both the House and the Senate. Unified government initially. But then came the midterms. And for the second half, the 116th Congress, 2019 to 2021, you had a split. Democrats took the House, while Republicans kept the Senate.
And that split is fundamental.
Totally. It completely changes the game for getting laws passed, dealing with budgets, investigations, everything.
Absolutely. That initial breakdown of who controlled what immediately signals, the potential paths that legislation could take. It really begs the question, how did the administration adapt its strategy when that landscape shifted so dramatically?
Right.
What we really see is them trying to maximize those legislative wins early on, and then, pivoting much more heavily towards executive actions when Congress became divided.
Okay, so let's dig into that first part then. Where did Congress and the administration actually manage to align? What were the major legislative achievements?
Well, the big one, right out of the gate almost, was tax reform.
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, passed in December of that year. And this wasn't minor tinkering. Our sources call it the largest overhaul of the U.S. tax code in, 30 years?
Yeah, 3 decades. It was substantial.
Key parts of it. Well, it slashed the corporate tax rate, big time, from 35% down to 21%.
A huge drop.
It also aimed to simplify the individual tax brackets, increased the standard deduction quite a bit.
Oh, wow.
Oh, and limited the state and local tax deductions, the SALT deductions.
Right, which had a big impact, particularly in higher tax states like New York and California. There was a lot of debate around that specifically.
For sure. The overall idea, though, was to really shift incentives, make the U.S. more attractive for businesses.
Exactly. The stated goal was boosting corporate investment. But, it immediately sparked intense debate about deficits, about income inequality, debates that are still very much alive today. It really showed a clear economic philosophy in action.
Okay, so that's the Tax Act. What else stands out from that period of unified government?
Well, something quite different in focus but also significant was criminal justice reform.
Ah, yes, the First Step Act. That was 2018. And what's maybe surprising about this one, given the climate, is that it actually got bipartisan support. Real bipartisan support.
Which was pretty rare during those years. It stood out.
It did. Its provisions included things like reducing mandatory minimum sentences for some nonviolent drug offenses, expanding rehabilitation programs inside prisons, and allowing more inmates to earn time off their sentences for good behavior.
It was seen by advocates as, a first step, as the name suggests, towards addressing some long-standing issues in the federal system.
And then moving into the later part of the term, but still requiring congressional action, was trade.
Right, the USMCA.
The USMCA trade agreement. Congress ratified that in 2020. It replaced NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Been around for decades, NAFTA.
Yeah. The USMCA updated the rules for trade with Mexico and Canada. It had specific focuses on things like auto manufacturing, new provisions on labor rights, and rules for digital trade, which obviously weren't a big factor when NAFTA was first written.
It represented a significant shift, or at least an update, in North American trade policy, fulfilling a key campaign promise.
Okay, so those are some major legislative wins: tax reform, criminal justice reform, a new trade deal. but it definitely wasn't all success.
No, not at all. Some major goals hit serious roadblocks.
Right. Where did Congress really push back or just fail to align with the administration? The most prominent example has to be the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare.
Oh, absolutely. The repeal attempts.
Multiple attempts. Despite Republicans controlling both the House and Senate initially, they just couldn't get it done. It famously culminated in that incredibly dramatic moment in July 2017.
Yeah, I remember watching that unfold live.
Senator John McCain's late-night vote.
Uh-huh.
Just a clear thumbs down on the Senate floor. That was the deciding vote that killed the so-called skinny repeal and effectively saved the ACA.
A truly memorable moment in Senate history. It showed the limit of party unity, even with control.
Definitely. And another major area of conflict was border wall and immigration funding.
Right. The wall was a central campaign promise.
A huge one. The administration pushed hard for, I think it was $5.7 billion, specifically for border wall construction. Congress wouldn't agree to that amount, and the result, a massive government shutdown. It lasted 35 days over December 2018 and into January 2019.
The longest in U.S. history. It had real consequences for federal workers and services.
It did. Eventually, Congress passed a compromise spending bill, but it included significantly less funding for the wall than the administration wanted. It was a major standoff.
These examples, the ACA failure, the shutdown over the wall, they really make you ask, what does this tell us about the limits of presidential power? Even when your party controls Congress, at least initially.
Yeah.
It just highlights that internal party divisions, or even just a few key legislators holding out, can completely derail an agenda. It underscores those checks and balances we always talk about. They were clearly at play.
So with those legislative avenues often blocked, especially after the Democrats took the House, what did the administration do?
They leaned much more heavily on executive power. Executive orders, administrative rulemaking, regulatory changes, basically using the tools available to the presidency that don't require direct congressional approval for every step.
Right. Finding a path around Congress, essentially. Let's break that down. Where did we see this most prominently? Immigration seems like a key area.
Definitely. You had the so-called travel ban right at the start,
which restricted entry from several Muslim-majority countries that went through multiple versions and court challenges.
and was eventually upheld in a modified form by the Supreme Court in 2018,
Then there was the highly controversial family separation policy at the border,
which drew widespread condemnation.
and also the attempt to end DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, protecting dreamers.
Right, but the Supreme Court blocked that effort in 2020, saying the administration hadn't followed the proper procedures to rescind it. So a mix of actions, some upheld, some blocked.
Okay, what about environmental deregulation? That was another major focus.
A very clear shift in policy there. The U.S. withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, which was a huge international agreement.
A big symbolic and practical move.
And domestically, numerous Obama-era environmental regulations were rolled back or weakened. Things like the Clean Power Plan, rules on methane emissions.
And there was also a push to expand oil and gas drilling on federal lands and waters.
Yes, opening up previously protected areas. A very concerted effort towards deregulation in the environmental space.
And then, of course, dominating the last year or so, the COVID-19 response.
Unavoidable, and largely driven by executive action initially.
A national emergency was declared in March 2020, and Congress did get involved with relief legislation, most notably the CARES Act.
That was a massive $2 trillion package, direct payments, the PPP loans for businesses, expanded unemployment aid. A huge bipartisan effort actually driven by the crisis.
Oh, true. But beyond the CARES Act, the response itself, the day-to-day management, that often involved the executive branch acting, sometimes clashing with others.
Right. There were frequent, very public disagreements with public health officials like Dr. Fauci and also with state governors over things like mask mandates, lockdowns, reopening strategies. It highlighted the real tension in managing a national crisis in a federal system.
So looking at all these executive actions, immigration, environment, COVID.
What's really striking is just the sheer volume and the breadth of it all. This reliance on executive power, especially when facing that divided Congress, it really shows how an administration can still push its agenda forward. It highlights that ongoing kind of tug of war between the executive and legislative branches and how presidents adapt when one path is blocked.
Now, these policy battles, the legislative fights, the executive orders, they didn't just happen in isolation. They sometimes escalated into direct formal confrontations between the president and Congress, namely impeachment.
Right. Twice, which is historically unprecedented for one term.
Let's take the first impeachment. That was 2019 into 2020. What were the charges?
Abuse of power and obstruction of Congress.
And the core issue revolved around Ukraine. The allegation was that the president pressured Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden, a political rival, and withheld military aid as leverage.
That was the heart of it.
The House of Representatives, then controlled by Democrats, voted to impeach in December 2019. The vote was largely along party lines.
Almost entirely, yeah.
But then it went to the Senate, controlled by Republicans, for the trial. And in February 2020, the Senate voted to acquit on both charges.
So impeached by the House, but not removed by the Senate.
Exactly. Then, just about a year later, came the second impeachment in January 2021.
Right at the very end of the term.
The context here was crucial. It happened in the immediate aftermath of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol building.
Mm-hmm.
And the single charge this time was incitement of insurrection.
A very serious charge.
The House voted to impeach again, and this time it wasn't strictly partisan. 10 House Republicans joined all the Democrats in voting yes.
That was significant, a bipartisan impeachment vote in the House.
It was. The trial in the Senate happened after Trump had left office, which was itself debated. In February 2021, the Senate again voted to acquit.
But the vote breakdown was different this time.
Very different. While it didn't reach the two-thirds majority needed for conviction, 7 Republican senators voted to convict. That was the most bipartisan conviction vote in any presidential impeachment trial in history.
These impeachments, both of them, they really put a spotlight on Congress's role in holding the executive branch accountable, don't they?
Absolutely.
And the fact that the second impeachment got that bipartisan support in the House and a notable number of Republican conviction votes in the Senate, that signals something interesting. Maybe about the perceived severity of the events, maybe about shifting dynamics within the Republican Party itself towards the very end.
Yeah, it suggests some fractures, or at least a willingness by some to break ranks under specific circumstances. So zooming out a bit from the specific events like impeachment, how would you characterize the overall relationship between the Trump administration and Congress during those 4 years, it seems? Complicated.
Complicated is a good word. Highly charged, definitely. You saw intense partisan polarization.
More than ever, it felt like.
It really did. Strong, unwavering support from the Republican base and most Republican members of Congress, but simultaneously incredibly deep, unified opposition from Democrats.
And the rhetoric reflected that. Lots of public clashes, especially with Democratic leaders like House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer.
Constant tension there. Publicly and, sources suggest, privately too.
But it wasn't just about Democrats versus Republicans. What about within the GOP itself? The internal GOP dynamics.
That's fascinating too. The president had undeniably huge influence over the Republican Party. Party loyalty became paramount.
You saw that play out with primaries, endorsements.
Absolutely. And it led to situations where some more traditional conservatives, people who might have clashed with the administration's style or policies, found themselves increasingly isolated. Figures like Senator Jeff Flake, Senator Bob Corker.
Both became vocal critics and didn't seek re-election.
Exactly. They and others either retired or were pushed out, suggesting a real shift in the party's center of gravity and the pressures faced by those who weren't fully aligned. It wasn't just policy, it was about loyalty and navigating these new norms.
And if we look at legislative productivity overall, putting aside the tax cuts and the First Step Act.
Well, as we touched on, compared to some past administrations, especially those with unified government early on, the number of major landmark laws passed by Congress was actually relatively low.
Right, which reinforces that point about strategy.
Exactly. It underscores how much of the administration's agenda, particularly after losing the House, was pursued through administrative actions, through executive orders, through regulatory changes, rather than through the traditional legislative process. A clear strategic adaptation.
Okay, let's briefly touch on the international stage as well. How did foreign policy interact with congressional oversight?
There were some major shifts in foreign policy that definitely drew congressional attention and sometimes pushback.
We already mentioned pulling out of the Paris Agreement. There were other big withdrawals from international agreements too, right?
Yes. The Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was a big one, and withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP trade agreement right at the beginning.
And the China trade war. That seemed to generate concern across the aisle.
It did. The administration imposed significant tariffs on Chinese goods. China retaliated with its own tariffs. It caused disruption for American farmers, manufacturers, consumers, and you heard bipartisan concern in Congress about the economic impact and the overall strategy.
Did Congress try to assert itself much on military policy?
Sometimes. There were instances where Congress, particularly Democrats, but sometimes with bipartisan support, tried to limit the president's authority regarding military actions. For example, there were efforts related to the War Powers Resolution concerning potential conflict with Iran.
Trying to reassert congressional authority over war making.
Exactly. So, placing this in the broader picture, these foreign policy moves and the congressional reactions really show how intertwined global actions and domestic politics are. And it highlights that Congress can still play an oversight role, even in foreign affairs, though the effectiveness varies. It's another aspect of that constant push and pull.
All right, let's bring this deep dive towards a conclusion, thinking about the legacy and impact of the Trump administration, particularly regarding its interaction with Congress and the policies enacted.
Yeah.
What stands out?
Well, in terms of policy shifts, you clearly see an emphasis on themes like nationalism, deregulation, and the America First approach permeating many decisions.
From trade to environment to immigration.
Right. But perhaps the most enduring legacy, the one most discussed in terms of long-term impact, is the judiciary.
Judicial appointments.
Huge numbers. Over 230 federal judges appointed to lifetime positions on district courts and courts of appeals. And critically, 3 Supreme Court justices, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett.
Reshaping the federal judiciary for decades.
Precisely. And that raises a huge question, doesn't it? How will these hundreds of judicial appointments, especially the 3 Supreme Court justices, shape legal precedent, interpretation of the Constitution, and just the overall direction of the country for potentially generations to come? That impact extends far, far beyond one presidential term.
A profound legacy, no question. And finally, what about the impact on congressional norms and the relationship between the branches?
Well, as we've discussed, this period definitely challenged and arguably redefined some aspects of the executive-legislative dynamic.
We saw that intensified use of executive orders when Congress was divided.
Yes, leaning heavily on administrative power. And beyond specific actions, the period also challenged traditional norms around presidential communication, rhetoric towards opponents, interactions with oversight bodies. Things felt different.
So, quite a journey we've taken here. We started off acknowledging how complex this period felt. Hopefully, this deep dive, drawing directly from the source materials we have, has helped provide a clearer, more structured understanding.
Yeah, moving beyond just headlines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Getting into the specifics of the legislative wins like tax reform, the roadblocks like the ACA repeal failure, the pivot to executive actions on immigration and the environment, the clashes leading to impeachment, and the shifts in foreign policy and judicial appointments.
And we hope that by unpacking these specific actions and interactions, the laws passed, the orders signed, the votes taken, the standoffs endured, you get a more nuanced feel for how American government actually functions, how power is sought, how it's used, and importantly, how it's checked and balanced, even in highly polarized times.
It really is a fascinating look at the system in action, warts and all, which leaves us with a final thought to mull over, something building on what we've discussed. Given those clear shifts we saw in the executive-legislative dynamics, particularly that ramped-up reliance on executive orders when the legislative path was blocked, what might that signal about the future balance of power between the president and Congress? Could this period set a precedent for how future administrations facing similar gridlock might operate? Something to think about.